Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. As you can see, I have the Zoom going. The camera's right here, if anybody's wondering where that angle's from. And we're recording this because a lot of us are quarantined or getting COVID, so trying to be very flexible. Hopefully we won't have to do this whole semester, but for now we'll Zoom it. And making sure I'm off mute. In the last class, I put it in Zoom and hit record and then had it on mute half the time. So it wasn't very effective. Okay, so everyone is here expecting economics. Everyone's in the right place. Anybody go over to DB 31? Yeah, sorry about the classroom change, the confusion there. Apparently the registrar was changing classrooms for some classes up until last week. So at least ours was changed last month, so we all were able to get on the same page. We'll probably be in this room the rest of the semester, but I don't know what's going on with the classroom assignments. They're still making changes, but I'll let you know if there's any change. Otherwise, expect to be in here. At break, we'll go ahead and turn in the practice problems up here. If you don't have them ready, 1 and 3 is due. Don't worry about it. Thursday's fine. In fact, I'll even take them next Tuesday. Just trying to be really flexible again. But also next Tuesday, the practice problems for this week are due, chapter 7. I think it says on the Moodle that maybe there's a chapter 6 practice problems, but there isn't, just chapter 7. Again, trying to be really flexible with that. Shouldn't cause anybody any stress. Remember, the practice problems are really there for you to get practice doing the midterm and final problems. Okay, so I don't really care if they're turning on time. The only reason why I set a due date to begin with is otherwise a lot of us would, if we don't have a due date, we just don't do it, keep putting it off. The other thing is once I have everyone turn it in, I'll give you the sample answers so you can use that to study for your midterm. Okay. Any other housekeeping? I don't think there's any other housekeeping. How you guys liking being back on campus? Yeah, okay. Yeah, wow, not very enthusiastic about being on campus. You know, it's mixed. I like being on campus. I went to the pilot house for lunch. I enjoyed that. But the downside is I had to put pants on today. And that was, don't like that. Yeah, but I think it'll be good. You know, there's just something missing about online class that we get in person. Hopefully we'll be more talkative. I like discussions in class, although you guys did pretty good. I have an MBA class I teach in the evenings this semester online, and I cannot get these people to talk to save my life. I probably could literally say, I'll fail you right now if you don't say something, and they would all be quiet. So you guys are doing really good as far as how much you interact. Okay, so let's review where we are. So we talked on chapter 1, we talked a little bit about principles, the principles of macro, or of all economics, really. And those are kind of the rules that we can kind of see hold up true almost overall of our data shows that people work in their self-interest and those rules. And then last week we did chapter 3, and it was a small chapter. And we took all week because you really need to understand supply and demand is the fundamental concept of all economics. This week we're going to do today we're going to do our third intro type chapter, and that's chapter 6. And today we're going to talk specifically what macroeconomics is. And I've been hinting so far in other lectures of what macro is. But we're going to dig a little deeper. And then chapter 7, which will start on Thursday, will be our first actual chapter of substance. That's why I don't have any practice problems of chapter 6, because it's really more just, again, another introduction. And actually, I did have another housekeeping item. Who is expecting to do a presentation today? Raise your hand. Okay, you two. Anybody else? What's your name? Claire. And okay, and you upload them to Moodle? Yes. Okay, great. After break, we'll do Claire and then Emmy. Okay. So let's get in a little bit more about what macro is. Get rid of this. Just make this go away. So knowing that's up there. All right. It goes away if I do that. That's always there. Okay. All right. Macro. Macroeconomics is a new study. It's a new discipline. Didn't exist before the Great Depression. Before the Great Depression, economics was largely based off of the invisible hand theory, the Adam Smith theory. In a free market, over the long run, things will just figure themselves out. And this changed in the Great Depression because, well, we had the Great Depression. But the weird thing is we learned about the Great Depression in school. I think probably you guys still did. I certainly did in school. And we never really learned, I never really learned that there was lots of depressions before. In fact, the 1800s, up until like the very turn of the century, the 1900s, there were recessions every few years and actual depressions every 10, 12, 15 years. It was just the way that the business cycle worked, the way everyone thought that you could avoid it. Everyone just kept saying, well, Adam Smith, right? He says the invisible hand will take care of it. Is there a place for you? Squeeze it anywhere. And then the Great Depression happened. And the Great Depression was so bad that some smart people said, hey, economists, tell us what we can do to fix this. One thing that made the Great Depression so bad is President Hoover. Now, if you're not a history buff, you might not know about President Hoover other than the Hoover Dam. He was the president of the United States in the late 1920s. And he actually turned what could have been a small blip in the economy into the Great Depression, in part because he believed in austerity, which is a term you still probably hear on the news now. Austerity meaning that you tighten your belt strings or your purse strings. I'm sorry, tighten your purse strings when there's a recession, and that's the wrong thing to do. We didn't know it back then. So President Hoover took the opportunity for the recession to then cut government spending and call in debts, and this contracted the economy even more. So after President Hoover, the incoming administration in the 30s, the FDR administration, turned to macroeconomics economists and said, tell me what I can do on the macro level. Help me understand how economic slumps happen and what we can do to fix them. All right, and this great little tidbit, Hoovervilles throughout the Great Depression were tent cities that popped up. Sarcastically called them Hoovervilles because everyone even back then realized that was the wrong thing to do, at least the people most affected by the recession, the Great Depression, knew that austerity was the wrong thing to do. So, what are we talking about when we say macro? Well, a micro question is, should I go to business school or should I take a job? But a macro question is, how many people are employed in the economy as a whole? Right? We don't care about individuals. You as an individual, we don't care about companies as an individual entity. That makes no impact to our analysis. We only care about everything together as a whole. So a micro question might be, how does Google determine a salary offer for an incoming employee? Well, we don't care about that. We care about what's the overall salary levels of all new MBA grads or of all entry-level positions or all positions. What determines the cost of a university offering a new course? Right? We don't care about that, but we want to know what the price levels of education is economy-wide. What government policy should be adopted to make it easier for low-income students to attend college? Well, this one almost seems like a macro, but it's not quite. Because really the macro twist would be what government policy should be adopted to promote employment and growth in the economy as a whole. Right? We don't care so much about a subset of individuals and how it might affect them as individuals. We want to know the total. How do we get more education, or how do we get more employment? And then what determines whether Citibank opens a new office in Shanghai versus what determines overall trade in goods and services and assets between the United States and China? Now, this is an interesting one because the whether they should open up an office in China is a microeconomic question. But in that analysis, they're going to have to take a look at macroeconomic trends. Right? So not only they have to determine what the cost is to rent space and to hire people and what the customer base is, these are all micro questions. They also have to look at, are there favorable trade policies? Is there a recession in the US coming that might impact the economy in China? Right? So a microeconomic analysis might include, and most likely does include, a macroeconomic, but the converse is not true. When we're doing economic analysis, we could care less about where a Citibank is going to open an office in China. Okay, so I've talked a little bit about a paradox. Paradox is when an outcome of something, the cause of something, is different than the effect. Something, the outcome shouldn't happen, is the opposite of what should happen. Right? We deal with this in economics, and we deal with in macro. And the paradox of thrift is the most commonly used one cited in macro. And that's that what's good for you as an individual is not what's good for the economy as a whole. So if you think you're going to lose your job because a recession's coming, then your natural instinct is probably going to be to what? Not spend, not buy a new car, not eat out more. You think your spouse is going to lose their job? You know, you adopt thrift. But what happens when you don't spend money and all your neighbors don't spend money? So if all my neighbors and I think we're going to lose our jobs, we're not going to go out to eat. And then those restaurants don't get income. And then they lay off workers. And it's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. So what's good for an individual is often not good for the economy as a whole. The answer is, if a recession's coming, we got to get everyone to spend more. That's really uncomfortable if you think a recession's coming. And when COVID hit and everyone's sat home, I bet a lot of us felt pretty uncomfortable spending money. But not spending money causes that self-fulfilling prophecy of these businesses go out of business. One of my favorite paradoxes, not really related to this class, but just in economics, is one called Joven's paradox. And that's when if you increase efficiency of something, the end result is you use more of that thing. So the example being if like light bulbs. So we switched from the old incandescent light bulbs, which took a lot of wattage, to power, to CFLs, and then to LEDs. This only happened like 12 years ago. There was a big push. And is to use a lot of electricity. Well, what happens is people then buy this LEDs or whatever, and then they leave their lights on more. Well, that's only going to cost me, 10 cents a week to run it. My old light bulb cost me $1. So I'm going to leave it on 24 hours a day. Or I'm going to buy a couple lights and have more light in this room. So anytime you have not anytime, but a lot of times when you have an efficiency on a resource, increased efficiency on how you use a resource, it leads to using more of that resource. Cars get more efficient, and then we drive more and we use more oil. But that's a different than macroeconomics problem. I just love it. I did my master thesis on it. Okay. So getting back to the history of macro. So Pre-1930s, the conventional wisdom was problems such as unemployment will resolve themselves through the invisible hand. Post-conventional wisdom is Keynesian economics, macroeconomics. Keynesian was one of the grandfathers of macro, and he and his peers came up with this idea that economic slumps are caused by inadequate spending. They can be mitigated by government intervention. So this is where we got the public works projects of the 30s, the Hoover Dam. Right? They called it the Hoover Dam. It actually made it after he was president. It started his last year. It was funded his last year of presidency. But the Grand Coulee Dam, all these projects that affected us in the West mostly, that allowed the West to grow, were these macroeconomic projects that were meant to spend. So here's it in data. So we have on this axis, we have world industrial output, and we have a time in months time scale here. So the purple is the Great Depression. So you see in the beginning of the Great Depression, output goes way down worldwide. But it just keeps going and keeps going and keeps going. The Great Recession starts going down, but then after just at a year, it stabilizes and goes up. Well, what's the difference? Difference is here we had no idea how to handle it. We're just waiting for the invisible hand to fix it. And here we started spending like crazy. $750 million TARP stimulus package, and then another $1 trillion stimulus package. Start pumping money into the economy. The odd thing about the Great Recession was they put a guy as the head of the Federal Reserve, right about here, right before we knew what was going on, that happened to be one of the foremost experts on the Great Depression. So he knew exactly, just a coincidence, he knew exactly what to do and what failed in the Great Depression. Ben Bernanke was his name. Anyway, stimulus, macroeconomics works. We have lots of data for it. Okay, this is from John Maynard Keynes, the grandfather of macroeconomics. So the long run is a misleading guide to current affairs. In the long run, we're all dead. Economists set themselves too easy, too useless a task. If in tempestuous seasons, they can only tell us when the storm is past, the ocean is flat again. So what he's talking about here is that, and it's still kind of a problem, economists can only really tell us what happened yesterday. They can tell us what happens today because we're using indicators that lag. But he's saying it's not good enough. He's saying, well, what's good to be an economist if people are 25% of the workforce is out of a job, people are literally starving to death, they're literally eating their shoes in the Great Depression, if we can't do something about it. And the other second more important part of this is he's absolutely right. Everyone is right. In the long run, a free economy will set itself right through the invisible hand. But in the long run, we're all dead. And it was so true in the Great Depression. People were literally dying on the streets. While fat cat politicians and economists said, "Oh, it'll work itself out." We have a ethical duty, if we can, to set the boat straight. Okay, so since the 30s, we've used two main tools: monetary policy and fiscal policy. That's what this class is all about. We're going to learn a lot about monetary policy and learn a lot about fiscal policy. And monetary policy is the policies that affect money. Great thing about being a government is we can make our own money. Wish I could make my own money, but I'd go to jail. But the US can make their own money, and they can take money out of the system. So that's monetary policy. Fiscal policy is what we do with that money that monetary policy makes as a government. The government does. The government can do two things. It can tax money and it can spend money. And both have major impacts to the health of the economy, both positive and negative. We often look at taxing as bad, but what we'll learn is that taxing money, taking money out of your pocket, has a tremendous benefit to the economy as a whole. And we'll see the math, how that works. Okay, and here's just some indicators, more showing you how the things are linked. So private sector employment, industrial production index. You see how we have this the business cycle right here. We have growth, overall trending up. And then we have these recessions where the growth slows down or stops, growth slows down or stops. But we can see they're all linked. So a recession will slow down and stop industrial production, and it will slow down private sector employment, right? As we would expect, but we need more than just our intuition. We need data. Okay, so recessions are these periods of downturn. Economic growth slows down, maybe stops. It's not really about contraction. This book is kind of vague on it, but in technical terms, recession is about slowing down growth and stopping growth. It's not about contraction. That's typically a depression. But that's the opposite of an expansion. An expansion is the growth. Macroeconomics' goal is to control both of these, because neither one is good and neither one's bad. You might think expansion is good, but it's not. Uncontrolled expansion leads to very bad outcomes, hyperinflation, greed, unethical behavior. I mean, the housing crisis was caused by a period of expansion. They kept trying to feed it, and companies, industry got more and more greedy and lowered their standards to feed that expansion. Okay, the business cycle is the cycle between growth and expansions, illustrated by this. All right. So overall, we have growth trend, so we have expansion, and slows down for recession, expansion, slows down for recession. We'll never ever get it to a solid line of just nice steady growth. There'll always be some cycle, but the goal is to make the cycle as minimal as possible. Yeah, that's what I was just saying here. So the goal is to tame it, to smooth it out. We'll never get rid of it. But we don't want, if this was a graph from the 1800s, you would see like gigantic swings. We don't want that either. We want it to be controllable and predictable. Okay, growth is not to be taken for granted. Growth is not the natural state of an economy. Plenty of economies over the history of mankind didn't grow. Some did, some didn't. If you look here on this chart going back to 1450, so the United Kingdom, you see, did not see in 1450 for 300 years much growth. It wasn't really until the Industrial Revolution that we started seeing massive growth in Western economies. And then you can see here in the United States, because we didn't exist back here, but we've seen steady growth. If you look at China, this is China, you would have well, if you went back enough, China would be like this, but they would stick, level out, and then suddenly be like this. But growth is not inevitable, and macroeconomics seeks to encourage stable, reliable growth. But why? Why do we want growth? I think I mentioned last week, one of our discussions that the price went down and quantity went up, and the quantity going up makes everyone better off, makes us richer. But why is that? Well, this is why. Growth, that means adding. It means more efficiency. That means lowering prices. So we can see in this 1960, 40% of people had a washing machine, 20% air conditioning, right? But now, because of growth, close to 90%, almost everyone has access to these technologies because they're more affordable. Growth led to innovation, creating cell phones and computers that have, or every household has one of these. That's why we talk about growth. Makes everyone richer, makes everyone better off. Now, what we have though in the past 30 years is we have an increasing existential dread over environmentalism and climate change. And we tend, some of us will link growth to that. It doesn't have to be linked though. Growth is not at the expense of cutting down forests or using our resources or polluting. That's how we've chosen to do it. But we can have economic growth in other ways. So growth is good. How we do growth has dramatic impacts to the world around us. Okay, inflation and deflation, big topics. Inflation is when pricing goes up. Inflation is not bad. Can be good, can be bad. Most though, and low inflation is good. But we can see here, this is what inflation is. The cost of things are going up. But look at our hourly earnings. So over this time period, I forget when this said it was. I think this was like from 80 till 2015. But whatever. Hourly earnings increased 232, but we didn't actually gain as a society that much because prices raised so much. It'd be much nicer if this was way over and we could say, yeah, we are better off as a society because we're way outpacing inflation. Not so much the case. If the prices went down overall, that's called deflation. Okay. Again, we're talking about macro here. So we're not talking about if one price goes up. So just because white bread has gotten so more expensive, that's not inflation. And we'll look at how inflation is measured. It's actually pretty interesting. You know, at the same time this price is going up, the price of TVs has gone dramatically down. Fancy TV 10 years, 20 years ago would have been $3,000 or $4,000. Now you can buy one for $300 or $400. So just because pricing is going down, it doesn't mean deflation. It means only if it's overall. Good. So in the short run, over the space of months and years, inflation is closely related to the business cycle. Things get overheated, money is exchanging hands, prices go up. During a recession, people stop spending slows down, prices tend to go stabilize or go down. In the long run, over the course of a long period of time, inflation is determined by the money supply. If there's physically more money, everyone has more. So you're willing to spend more on things. So it causes inflation. So inflation and deflation is really bad. Inflation is not bad. Uncontrolled inflation can be bad, but inflation is actually good. We target in this country, we target 2% a year. We actually don't want to go down below 2%, and which it has. So last decade, inflation actually been below 2%, and we don't like that so much. Having inflation causes people to spend money. It discourages people from holding on to cash. If your money is losing value every day, you're less likely to put it under the mattress. You're going to go out and spend it. Problem though is that if you spend too much of it, you start buying into assets like houses and real estate and other places to hold on to money because they appreciate while inflation is taking the value of your cash. And then that causes prices in like real estate to go up and other assets. So there's trade-offs. The worst thing though is deflation. This is a pretty easy concept to understand. If I go to buy something TV, for example, and it's $1,000, and I go in to buy it, and the salesman says, "Oh, you shouldn't buy it today. You should buy it next week. There's going to be a sale." Well, of course, I'm going to wait till next week, because if I wait, I spend less money. But what happens if that's happened not because there's sale, but because there's deflation in our economy, and every week all prices are going down? I'm not going to spend anything. Why would I spend money today for anything I didn't have to? Because I can save money by buying it next week. The next week comes around and I save money then. So I don't buy it. So deflation is one of the worst things that can happen to an economy. It's very bad. It causes everything to come to a halt. It's probably as bad or worse than hyperinflation. Okay, so on to a new subject here in macro is trade. Trade, here we're talking about international trade. US trading with China or other countries. Now, we're not talking about the governments trading with the governments, which it could be part of it. We're talking about private citizens. And the US can trade with private citizens in China. That is allowed because we have an open economy. You can't trade with, you as a person can't trade with Cuba. You can't trade with Iran. There's a couple for political reasons that our government says no. But every other country on the planet, if that country will trade with you as a private citizen, you're welcome to do that. There's two macro concepts. There's how much we send of goods and services we send to that country that's exporting, and how much goods and services we bring from them that's importing. And we can import more than we export. We can export more than we import, or it could be the same. If we're importing more, it's a trade deficit. And if we're exporting more, it's a trade surplus. Now, this is probably the only, in my head, this makes sense in a way that it's probably the only way that you can relate this to your personal finances. Every other concept we talk about doesn't relate. In other concepts, we're talking about taxing and spending and borrowing. It doesn't apply to how you spend and borrow, because you can't make your own money. The US can, right? No other concept in this class, I think, really relates to any personal finance except for this. Importing is kind of like your salary or the money you're spending, and exporting is kind of like your salary. So if a country is exporting more, they're taking in exchange money. It's like income to the country. And if you're importing, you're sending, when we import everything from China, we're sending them money. So it's kind of like a bill. It's kind of like we're putting it on the credit card. So a trade deficit, that's why it's called a deficit. If we're importing more than we're exporting, it's kind of like we're spending more than we're making. Vice versa, if we have a surplus, it's kind of like we're making more than we're spending. So China has run surpluses for decades now, taking in so much money from the rest of the world, and pulling billions out of poverty and building huge cities with that. Meanwhile, we are kind of spending. We're living the good life on borrowed trade deficit dime, but that's not necessarily bad. It's always trade-offs. It's not bad because we get stuff so much cheaper. So we get more. It's more utility for us. We're able to then specialize our people in other things besides manufacturing. So there's always trade-offs. But I would say if there's one concept that you can relate to your personal, it's that trade deficit is spending more than you make, and surplus is making more than you spend. So here's an example to when this book was published of trade deficits and surplus. You see United States, we exported 1.5 trillion, we imported 2.3-ish trillion. So we were only making this much on the international scene, but spending this much. Meanwhile, Germany and China are the exact opposite. Oh. Yeah, I guess that's the PowerPoint. Okay, any questions on that? All right. Should we take a break? Oh, yeah.
Would purposely like changing the business cycle in a way, like say for example, like purposely doing a recession or a or depression,
Yeah.
would that be beneficial or would that cause more harm?
Interesting. And that question would have been dumb 2 years ago. I wouldn't have been dumb. I'm exaggerating. It would have been a weird question 2 years ago, but we just did this. We just caused a recession. Pandemic hit and we said, everyone go home, no one work. It caused a major recession. So did that cause more? So economically, there's an analysis there, but then economics is only part of our lives. Was in the long run, we're all dead, right? Well, in the pandemic would have been the short run, we're all dead if we didn't do something. So there was benefit there. Economically, yes, I think we're going to find that we're way better off, and the biggest reason for that is that we have hastened a digital transformation that we haven't seen in this country before. Life will never be the same. Because of the pandemic and forcing this recession, we had to hasten the visible handness of working from home, of computer technology use, of efficiency. So yeah, I think in this case, we saw that you can hasten the cause a recession for benefit. I don't know if we would want to do it again, though. It's pretty tough. Okay, well, why don't we take a break 15 after, and then we'll do our presentations and our quiz.
A few minutes late time.
Oh, no. No, just the practice problems, if you don't. Oh, if you have your practice problems, bring them up. Practice problems 1 and 2 today, late problem, and 7 next Tuesday. That's about it. And we'll be in this room. There's been some confusion what room we're in.
I went to, I was like,
Yeah.
on the road.
That's fine. If you don't have a stapler, just kind of fold over the corner. Kind of keeps it together. Okay. Oh, turn the projector off. All right, we'll get going with our presentations. So with these presentations, I try to put the grade in right away, right after you do it, when it's fresh in my mind. But if you look in the Moodle and you don't see your grade after you did it, it should be an email. Make sure I didn't forget. Okay, so I think we'll start with Claire. Do you want to come up?
Where do you want me to stand?
Right over here, I'll move. It's a PDF, so I found the easiest way to go between the slides like that, but do it any way you want. And just refresh our memory what you're going to talk about and then get going.
Okay. Okay, so I had two different ones from chapter 6. The first one was the intro, so it was the Greek tragedies one. Both of my presentations are pretty similar to what we just talked about in class, so they're kind of a refresher, but it gives a different perspective with some examples in it. So for Greek tragedies, it talked about the recession, and in 2007 there was a recession here. It started in about December, and the U.S. recovered from it pretty quickly because of the way that we implemented policies and things like that. But other countries and places around the world, they were affected for a longer amount of time. So like in Greece, for example, they were not really fully recovered in 2015. So the example used was a girl who has a law degree, which normally that would guarantee you a job. If you have a law degree, like that's your education status would essentially guarantee you a job. But in 2015, she got laid off. And so then that example was used to talk about how in 2015, the unemployment rate was really, really high in Greece, especially among young people, and how she wasn't guaranteed a job in 2015, but in the mid 2000s, she would have gotten a job right out of college. And so we know more now about depressions and recessions because of macroeconomics after the Great Depression. And here are some terms. We went over most of these in class, but it's just on the screen right here so that you have more of an understanding of what's in the slides. Okay, and then this is featured because this chapter talks about business cycles, long-run economic growth, recessions, inflation, deflation, and then just like overarching economic trends and how we understand them. I thought that this example provided a pretty accessible view of how we personally could be affected. We're in college right now, so we're thinking about what we're going to do when we get out of it, and whether or not jobs will be available. Definitely in high school, that was something that I was told, like, you need to go choose something that you know you're going to be able to get a job in. And there's definitely some majors that lend themselves more to getting a better job out of college. And then the recession in America, I watched a couple of videos about it. I'm not super knowledgeable about it, but from my understanding, what was happening was that the housing market was really, really profitable. So people were investing their money into housing, and then it just like was skyrocketing. So banks were giving out more subprime mortgages, which is to people who have lower credit. So they're less likely to pay back the loan. So it's kind of a gamble for banks to do that. But since the housing market was so profitable, they were giving out so many of these, and like houses were really, their prices were inflating a bunch. So if you bought a house for like $200,000 in a couple of years, it might be worth $500,000 and you could sell it and you would make a big profit from that. But in 2007, the bubble burst and people weren't making money. So the price of their house was going down, and then pretty much like everybody lost a bunch of money. And so that's why the recession happened, along with other things, but this was the main cause of the recession. And because of macroeconomics, our overall understanding of the economy has improved, because people are in the chapter, it said that this was an avoidable crisis if we had just made the correct policy decisions. Okay, and then the second one was the economics in action. And they just, in the section, it said that the 2008 crisis, the recession, because of the housing market, was on track to be equal or worse than the Great Depression. The first year, as we saw on that chart earlier, that was featured in the Economics in Action. The numbers were very similar, so the chart the recession easily could have followed the same pattern. But the turning point was after about 11 months because policymakers responded differently. Rather than raising taxes and discouraging spending, the policies encouraged people to increase their spending, and taxes were reduced so that the economy could build itself up again. And then this one I thought was featured to discuss how policies and individual changes can influence the economy. In the Great Depression, it was the invisible hand policy. So just like the Depression should be able to run itself through. But in 2007, choices were made so that we didn't follow in the same footsteps and go through another Great Depression. And then from situations like these, we obviously learn more every time something like this happens, but it will help us to prevent major crises like these happening in the future. And the principle that this talks about is principle number 12, government policies can change spendings. The book describes this policy as the government can vary how much it spends on various things, how much it collects in taxes, and the quantity of money in circulation. And all of these are macroeconomic tools. And then the example of how this was used was in the 2007-2008 recession, so that we could sustain spending and not result in the same thing that happened in the 1930s. And there's no excited.
Great. All right. So another great presentation. I'm very happy with how serious you're taking these presentations. I know it can get kind of weird because I just talked about it and you come up and like, well, here's the same thing Dr. Stratton just said. But please don't get weird about it. Go ahead and repeat it. I guarantee you half the audience is tuned out when I was talking about, so maybe they'll hear it when you talk about it, or when you're doing your presentation. So good job. But I wanted to talk about a couple things that you brought up. Let me go back up. Okay, in Greece. So one of the things about those, so unique about Greece is Greece was not part of the European Union at the time. So what does that mean? Well, they didn't follow some of the economic policies the European Union was doing, but also meant the free flow of labor across borders wasn't there. So if you're in France or Germany and you hit unemployment, you can look for jobs anywhere in Europe, this part of the Union. Greece, you couldn't. So it caused a massive unemployment crisis. Plus, they didn't have a strong central bank, and there was all sorts of reasons. They didn't follow the trend in Europe as a whole of recovering quick. But I don't know if you guys remember, it was on the news a lot at this time, 5 or 6 years ago, riots and young people, unemployment was like 30% or higher. People had no money, no jobs, and they were literally like trying to burn down the country. The other thing, yeah, so I know a lot of you guys were probably too young to really understand what was happening. I mean, I was in law school during this recession, 2008 recession. I didn't really understand what was happening. So if you guys were like 7, right, you really wouldn't have. But yeah, so housing was always considered a safe investment under certain circumstances, but it was very restricted because 100 years ago, people would take advantage of the unsuspecting. So there was all these laws put in place, and then there's federal semi-governmental agencies that monitor, like Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, and they set rules for banks to give out mortgages, and the rules were always something like 20% down, and you have to have a certain credit and certain income, no more than 40% debt to income ratio. And that's what the bank has to follow to give the money. And then there's rules for the bank and how much debt they can hold. And we're going to learn all these rules in this class, actually. There's rules about how much debt banks can hold. So banks will originate the loan. they'll give you the money for your mortgage. They'll start collecting the first few payments, and then they'll sell your mortgage on to somebody else. Typically, it's Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac, these quasi-governmental entities that hold all this debt and collect your payments. Well, what changed is that some really bright people on Wall Street, sarcastically, they're bright, said, well, wait a minute, what if instead of letting banks sell to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, what if on Wall Street we start buying these mortgages? So then banks can then have another place they can sell their mortgage off, and then they can then lend out more money, and sell it off because they can have more places to unload that burden. And then the Wall Street's like, well, I know how we can even make it safer, because what we'll do is we'll take some mortgages that are high risk, and we'll package those with low risk mortgages, and then the investors' overall risk is low, and that's what they call the tranches of risk. So then banks were incentivized to give out as much money as they possibly could, because they can turn around the next day and sell it to Wall Street. And then Wall Street was selling it to investors, saying it's so safe. Even if you have a risky person got a mortgage, that's only one part of what you're buying into, because you're also buying all the safe mortgages. So there's no risk here. Everything's fine. So there was no checks on the system. Everyone thought there was no downside. And then they started doing things like regular work average middle class people started not needing any more mortgages. So then the banks are like, well, how about we go to subprime, people with horrible credit ratings? What about if we don't even make people prove their income? If they tell me they make $100,000 a year, we'll just believe it. We won't even look at a pay stub, why not? Because the next day they'll sell it to somebody else, and there's no risk for that. So it caused one of the greatest expansionary periods in US history, fueled by that. Everyone thought they were outsmarted the risk, and it all came crashing down. So that's why we want to have governmental policies that slow down expansion. Okay, so that's my spiel on the Depression. Great job, Claire. Let's go to Emmy.
Mine's not as bright as Claire's.
Oh, that's fine.
All right, so what I covered, again, Claire said it was already kind of talked about, but I am covering the comparison of recessions and the decline of Montgomery Ward. So what is a recession? As defined in the textbook, a broad-based downturn in which output and employment fall in many industries. And an expansion is when the economy isn't in a recession, when most economic numbers are pointing upwards. And then the business cycle is the comparison of them to the relationship between them and how they work together. So a business cycle peak is as expansion turns into recession. So as it starts to downturn. And then the business cycle trough is as a recession shifts to expansion. So in these kind of points right here, and it changes all the time. So while looking at the graph, you can assume that the 2001 recession had a more mild impact on the economy. But you have to remember that millions of people lost their lives, businesses were shutting down, and in that way you can look into context how drastic the 2007 to 2009 recession was. There's a couple questions in my section. It's why do we talk about business cycles for the economy as a whole, rather than just talking about the ups and downs of particular industries? And that's because recessions and expansions include industries around the country and around the world. And that's the way that we can look at the impact as a whole, because individual industries are impacted altogether. My next section was the decline of Montgomery Ward. It was a business case. What is or was Montgomery Ward? It was the original department store, because it doesn't really exist. That's the term that I went with. It's the first mail order business. So they had catalogs and you could order what you wanted, things that local stores didn't offer. So people living in rural areas could order things that people in cities would have more access to. It changed the way that we looked at living in rural areas and even in cities as well, because you could have access to the same or relatively the same materials. Today, Sears, which was inspired by the pioneering of Montgomery Ward, still has a catalog, where you can order items from TVs and large appliances to clothing and fine jewelry. And by the 1920s, both Montgomery Ward and Sears had physical stores open, and they competed for dominance until World War II, when Montgomery Ward fell behind, resulting in the permanent closure of all locations by 2000. But why? So during the Great Depression, Montgomery Ward closed down locations and liquidated some assets in order to keep their most profitable stores open. So after World War II, they did the same thing. They downsized and held on to money in the event that their accounts went into the red so they could stay open. They severely misjudged, and there was a huge economic surge after World War II. And while competitors like Sears expanded with the demanding market, they sat on their resources. Finally, in 1959, they made the choice to expand, but they had already fallen so far behind, they were not a competition anymore. Today, Sears has fallen kind of in the same curse. There's, I think, 22 stores nationwide open. They're probably gonna close their last stores soon, and they fell behind to places like Walmart and Target. So here I have the comparison between the Great Depression and the Great Recession. And why was it profitable for Montgomery Ward to close some of its stores during the Great Depression? Because they were able to hold on to assets in case there was more of a dip and their profits were no longer making them money and keeping stores open. And what about the Great Depression made Montgomery Ward's decision to not expand in the 1940s appear rational? Because they'd already been successful in going into and coming out of a recession, so they thought they would apply the same idea and they would be okay. And so it was suggested that you bring in some of your own research. There's a small town on the coast of Washington, kind of where I'm from. It's called Seabrook, Washington. I don't know if anyone has heard of it. It's a tiny little resort town, and they were founded in 2008. My sister is a marketing director of the town, so I've been able to look into how they're expanding. And so in the recession, they were in the peak of building homes, these luxury homes that were $800,000 and above. So instead of halting all production of homes because they didn't want to fall behind, they started opening up 2 homes on each plot to ensure that people that wanted to buy homes were still able to, and they didn't have to halt completely all of their sales because they were worried about the same thing that Montgomery Ward and Sears are facing. And that's all.
All right. Excellent presentation. I absolutely loved your personal story with that. Really interesting. Choosing the white and the black is actually pretty good. If you know anything, if you had a presentation class, what they'll tell you is that the less distracting your visuals are, the more they'll focus on you, and that's what you want. I'm always too not insecure to have you guys focus completely on me, so I like it right. So you're looking there. So these are 2 amazing topics. I could go on. I could do a whole lecture on the Sears debacle. Sears is gone pretty much now. Sears for almost a century was the catalog retailer. Now think what a catalog is. Catalog is e-commerce before there was internet. You get it in the mail, but then you send it off, send money, and they send it to you. Why isn't Sears still around? Well, Sears took their catalog business and dismantled it in the mid-90s. Just years, just a year or 2 before the dot-com bubble that turned us all into, turned Amazon into the biggest company in the world, or second biggest company. It's taught, and if you go to MBA, you'll learn all about Sears and the biggest disaster of dismantling the catalog right for e-commerce. But I did want to also mention here, so this is an interesting graph. So this recession was caused by exuberance in investment money. So people were taking out these loans, refinancing, buying second and third houses for this kind of fear of missing out. Oh, the housing prices are going up so quick. I should take advantage of this, or it's kind of it's over exuberance in the market. The overexuberance that causes an expansion. Same thing happened here, but that was in the late 90s tech boom. So internet was a thing from a new thing. Everyone realized it was the future. No one knew quite how it was. So everyone had this fear of missing out that they have to invest in buy stocks and all the new internet startups coming in. Most of them didn't have any business plan, didn't have any customers, didn't have any way to make money, but no one cared. And so there was this huge business cycle expansion across the economy led by this exuberance in tech. And then it popped in 2000 and led to the 2001 recession. And how did we get out of that? We got out of that because the President Bush's administration sent out 2 stimulus checks for just a little bit of money. Mid-year, you got everyone in the country got a check for like $100, $150. Why would they do that? Well, it was absolutely brilliant. They did it because it's not enough to do anything with. You're not gonna buy a stock with it. You're not gonna put it in your mattress. You're gonna take your wife out to dinner, buy your kids the latest Wii game. So they sent out these checks. They were almost all immediately put back into the economy the next day. So that was a macroeconomic tool that they used. Okay, well, I am done. So let's do let's do our quiz. When the quiz is done, if you're quiet, you can leave, and I'll see you Thursday.